Do you ever have a bowl that you thought you threw perfectly centered, only for it to have quite a severe undulation in the rim the following day? Well, that's exactly what happened with this tiny bowl, and in this quick video I'll show you how I go about correcting this. It's worth mentioning though, that if it's only subtle, I won't even bother fixing it. If pots have very slight undulations in their rims, then as soon as the wheel stops spinning around, then you'll no longer even notice them. But in this case, I'll show you how I fix it. I begin by flipping the piece upside down and tap center it, so it's spinning right in the middle of the wheel. I then take 3 lumps of soft clay and gently push them around the lip of the pot, whilst maintaining pressure on top of the vessel so the piece isn't pushed to one side as the clay is pressed against it. And from this angle you can see just how much the base of the pot is undulating up and down. And if I hold the tip of a needle against it, you can see that it only comes into contact with the highest point that spins around. And so the first thing I have to do is trim away that high point, making the base completely level. And I find the best tool to do that with is this straight-edged tungsten carbide turning tool made by Philip Poberger of Bison. And initially, as I trim, I'm focusing my pressure on that high point until I can feel that the blade is making contact all the way around. Thereafter, I'll just turn it until it's perfectly flat, and I make sure there isn't a high point in the middle. As if it's slightly raised, the bowl won't sit flat when I flip it back the other way around. And you can see that when I offer a needle up to it, it now makes contact all the way around. And when flipped back over, you can see how it spins around much more evenly. But there's still something else I can do to make it just that tiny bit better, although it is really overkill at this point. I attach the bowl to the metal wheel head with a small amount of slip, tap center it into place, and then squash some of the clay from the base into the metal wheel head. And to fix that last bit of movement in the rim, I clasp this kidney very tightly and gently hold it against the rim, which forces the still quite soft clay against it. I can even push the rim down onto it, but even when clay is leather hard, it's still relatively malleable and can be altered at this point, and it's even something I do to make lids fit on pots when I don't have enough material to work with or trim away, so I'll simply push it into the right place. With the undulation fixed, I'll spend a few moments just sharpening up the features on the interior of this bowl, from trimming the flange and creating a slight groove around the top, to making sure that the interior has a lovely smooth curve from top to bottom. Switching from metal to rubber to soften the curve, and of course I'm using a tool which has a curve to it, one with a profile that matches the interior of the pot I'm working on. I separate the bowl from the wheel by sliding a sharp metal knife beneath it. And it's usually at this stage when I'm trimming pots that I feel the cross-section of the wall and gauge just how much I need to trim away from the different areas. And this is something you can do midway through the process. If you feel like you're not quite sure how much more clay you can remove, there's no harm in stopping to trim, removing the pot from the wheel, feeling the cross-section and then placing it back down. In this case, I'm just using a spinner initially to keep the vessel pinned in place, so I can trim the rim of the bowl without these bits of clay getting in the way. And now I can begin to trim the rest of the foot, which can be quite a fiddly task on a bowl this small. And of course, to compensate for that, I end up using smaller trimming tools compared to the larger blades I'll use on bigger pots. And all I'll be doing for this vessel is trimming an angular exterior, whilst the interior keeps its nice rounded shape. The fingers of my left hand are constantly pushing down quite firmly against the clay, as without any downward pressure, pots can quite easily dislodge when only secured in place by 3 pieces of clay like this. I then use one of my tiniest turning tools to trim the 2 facets that surround the foot. And inevitably, as one of the facets of the foot slopes inwards, I have to correct this portion of the bowl so the 2 meet at a nice sharp angle. And actually this tiny steel turning tool leaves quite a nice smooth surface, especially compared to my tungsten carbide trimmers, which can leave quite a rough, torn surface. So typically I'll do most of my finishing with these cheaper steel tools, as they leave a sort of burnished surface as they tear clay away. The next step is to begin hollowing out the foot ring, which I do bit by bit with the tool held very tightly. as it's quite easy at this point for the tool to catch and remove more clay than you would like, and if you end up digging that clay out of the external portion of the foot ring, it leaves the bowl pretty much ruined, as if you don't have enough material left to work with in order to fix the problem, then you may as well simply start again and throw the bowl anew. As I trim downward, I test the thickness of the base by very lightly pressing down with my thumb. If it feels solid and strong, I know that I can continue trimming, but if there's any movement and it bows down slightly, then I won't remove any more clay from the base, as it's so easy to accidentally trim all the way through the bottom. I tidy up the foot, removing stoneware just to make the foot ring not appear quite so bulky. And then, at last, it can be stamped with my maker's mark, which was made to fit perfectly on this portion of my small bowls. This displaces some clay upwards, creating a small bump of clay, so the last thing I do is trim that flat. The pieces of soft clay are then removed, and the pot is briefly assessed. Although, with this bowl, I felt like there was just a bit more weight in the vessel that I could remove, just in this portion of the wall, where the angle changes. So, it's placed back onto the wheel, and very gently tap-centered into the middle as not to damage the pot. It's secured back in place, and then I quickly trim away the last of that excess weight. Much better. Now it floats up, almost defying my expectations, as it's so light, although it will get heavier, as this entire pot will be coated with a thick layer of crackle glaze, which ends up actually adding quite a bit of weight back to the pot. In some ways, that's why I trim vessels as much as I do, as if I threw my pieces a bit thicker, balanced, yet heavier, then by the time all the glaze is dipped over them, then they'd end up being quite weighty objects. Whereas this bowl weighs just 78 grams, and was probably thrown with about 150 to begin with. Short and simple this week, as I've actually been in Japan holidaying for the last 2 weeks, which has been some very welcome time off, as I'm not great at giving myself breaks. And as always, if there's ever anything you want me to make a video about, please do tell me in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next time.